The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters in Coronado, California. Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her crisp Navy uniform as she walked through the corridors, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. At 28, she had already earned more commendations than most officers twice her age, but today felt different. Today, she was about to face a challenge that would test not just her military expertise, but her ability to command respect in a world dominated by testosterone and tradition. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Oregon, where her father ran a struggling auto repair shop and her mother worked double shifts at the local hospital. Money was always tight, but her parents instilled in her the values of hard work, integrity, and never backing down from a challenge. When she announced her intention to join the Navy after high school, her father had looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "The military isn't easy for anyone, sweetheart," he had said, his weathered hands still smelling of motor oil. "But for a young woman like you, it's going to be 10 times harder. You sure you're ready for that?" Sarah had nodded without hesitation. She had been ready her whole life. Her journey through the Naval Academy had been marked by excellence. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in international relations, but what truly set her apart was her strategic mind and natural leadership abilities. Her professors noted her unusual talent for reading complex military situations and developing innovative solutions that others overlooked. She wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest cadet, but she had something more valuable, an intuitive understanding of warfare that couldn't be taught. After graduation, Sarah had requested assignment to the most challenging programs the Navy offered. She completed advanced surface warfare training, earned her qualification as a naval flight officer, and then shocked everyone by successfully completing the grueling SEAL qualification course as one of the first women ever to do so. The training had nearly broken her physically, but mentally, she had never been stronger. Now, walking through the halls of Spec War Command, Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence. Her slight frame and youthful appearance often led people to underestimate her, something she had learned to use to her advantage. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to assess a room full of military personnel and immediately identify the power structures, the personalities, and the best approach to achieve her objectives. The briefing room she entered that morning was filled with some of the most elite warriors in the American military. Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon operatives, Army Rangers, and Air Force Special Operations personnel sat around a massive conference table, studying classified documents and satellite imagery. The mission they were about to discuss would take place in a hostile region of Eastern Europe, where intelligence suggested a high-value terrorist target was planning an imminent attack on American interests. Sarah took her assigned seat near the back of the room, noting how several of the men glanced at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. She had grown accustomed to these looks over the years. In their world, women were nurses, intelligence analysts, or support personnel. They weren't supposed to be sitting in briefing rooms discussing direct action missions. The commanding officer, Captain Morrison, was a 25-year veteran with silver hair and scars that told stories of countless deployments. He had initially been resistant to having women in special operations roles, but Sarah's record spoke for itself. Still, she could sense his discomfort as he began the briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of military service. "What I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. 3 days ago, our intelligence assets identified a terrorist cell operating out of a compound in the mountains of Belarus. The leader of this cell, known only as the Engineer, is believed to be responsible for the recent bombing of the American embassy in Prague that killed 14 people, including 5 American citizens." The room fell silent as Morrison clicked to the next slide, showing satellite images of a remote compound surrounded by dense forest. Sarah studied the imagery carefully, her mind already beginning to process the tactical challenges such a mission would present. The compound was positioned on high ground with excellent sight lines in all directions. Any conventional assault would result in heavy casualties. The Belarusian government has refused to cooperate with our requests for extradition, Morrison continued. Therefore, the president has authorized a direct action mission to capture or eliminate this target. The operation will require a small, highly skilled team capable of infiltrating the compound, neutralizing the threat, and extracting without detection. A Navy SEAL named Rodriguez, whose massive frame and scarred face marked him as a veteran of dozens of combat missions, raised his hand. "Sir, what kind of intelligence do we have on the compound's defenses?" Morrison clicked to another slide showing thermal imaging and communication intercepts. Preliminary reconnaissance suggests approximately 15 to 20 armed guards, multiple weapon emplacements, and sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. The compound is essentially a fortress designed specifically to repel exactly the kind of mission we're planning. Sarah leaned forward, studying the images more carefully. Something about the compound's layout struck her as unusual. The placement of the guard towers, the positioning of the main building, the way the access roads were configured, it all seemed to follow a pattern she recognized from her studies of Soviet-era military architecture. Another SEAL, Petty Officer First Class Jackson, spoke up. "Captain, with respect, this looks like a suicide mission. Even with our best operators, getting in and out of that place without taking casualties seems unlikely." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Sarah could see the doubt in their faces, the recognition that this mission pushed the boundaries of what even elite special operations forces could accomplish. But as she continued to study the satellite imagery, an idea began to form in her mind. The compound designers had made it nearly impregnable against conventional assault, but they had also created a weakness that only someone with her specific background and training might recognize. During her time at the Naval War College, she had written her thesis on asymmetric warfare tactics used by resistance fighters during World War II. One of the case studies she had examined involved a similar compound that had been considered impossible to assault until a small team found an unexpected way to exploit its defenses. Sarah raised her hand slowly. The room turned to look at her, and she could feel the weight of their attention. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed almost annoyed that she would presume to contribute to such a high-level tactical discussion. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I believe I may have identified a potential approach that could significantly improve our chances of mission success." Morrison paused, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing interest. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." Sarah stood and walked to the front of the room, pointing to specific features on the satellite images. If you look at the compound's layout, you can see that it follows classic Soviet defensive doctrine from the 1960s. The designers were primarily concerned with preventing vehicle-borne attacks and large-scale infantry assaults. However, they made several assumptions about how such an attack would be conducted. She traced her finger along the images, highlighting areas that the others had overlooked. The guard towers are positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against approaches from the valley below, but they create blind spots at specific angles. More importantly, the electronic surveillance system appears to be focused on detecting large groups of people or vehicles, not individual operators using specific infiltration techniques. The room was completely quiet now, everyone focused on Sarah's analysis. Even the most skeptical faces showed signs of interest as she continued her explanation. "The key vulnerability is here," she said, pointing to what appeared to be a maintenance shed near the compound's eastern wall. "This structure houses the backup generators for the surveillance system. If a small team could reach this building and disable the power, they would create a window of approximately 4 to 6 minutes before the backup systems came online. During that window, the compound's electronic defenses would be completely blind." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Even if we could take out the power, how will we get close enough to do it? The open ground around that shed is covered by at least 3 guard posts." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's where the Soviet doctrine becomes a liability rather than an asset. The guards are positioned to watch for threats approaching from ground level, but the terrain features around the compound create natural concealment for operators using vertical infiltration techniques. She clicked to a topographical map that showed the steep ridgelines surrounding the compound. A team could approach from the north ridge using mountaineering techniques, then use controlled rappelling to position themselves directly above the surveillance blind spots. From there, it will be possible to reach the generator building without being detected. Captain Morrison studied the maps carefully, his experienced eye evaluating Sarah's proposal. The technical challenges would be enormous, he said finally. We're talking about a night insertion in hostile territory, followed by what amounts to a mountain climbing expedition, all while carrying full tactical gear. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. But it's achievable with the right team composition. The mission would require operators with advanced mountaineering qualifications, expertise in electronic warfare, and the ability to conduct precise tactical movements in extreme terrain. A Marine Force recon officer named Williams spoke up. Lieutenant, with respect, you're describing capabilities that exist in maybe a dozen operators across all of our Special Forces units. And even if we could assemble such a team, the risk factors would still be off the charts. Sarah nodded. You're absolutely right about the specialized skills required. However, I believe the risk assessment changes significantly when you consider the alternative approaches. A conventional assault on this compound would likely result in multiple casualties and a high probability of mission failure. The approach I'm proposing carries substantial technical risks, but it also offers the best chance of achieving our objectives while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The debate continued for another hour, with various officers raising questions and concerns about Sarah's proposal. She answered each point methodically, demonstrating a depth of tactical knowledge that impressed even the most seasoned veterans in the room. Her analysis wasn't just theoretical. She had clearly thought through every aspect of the mission from insertion to extraction. Finally, Captain Morrison called for a break. I want to review these proposals with my staff, he announced. We'll reconvene at 1,400 hours for final mission planning. As the room emptied, several of the Special Operations personnel approached Sarah. Rodriguez, the massive Navy SEAL who had initially questioned the mission's feasibility, extended his hand. That was some serious tactical analysis, Lieutenant, he said. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone break down a target like that. Where did you learn to think like that? Sarah shook his hand firmly. A combination of formal education and practical experience, she replied. But mostly, I've learned that the most important skill in special operations isn't physical strength or marksmanship. It's the ability to see solutions that others miss. Jackson, the other SEAL, nodded in agreement. If Captain Morrison approved your plan, would you be leading the technical aspects of the mission? That would depend on the command structure, Sarah said diplomatically. My role would be whatever best serves mission success. As the Special Operations personnel filed out of the briefing room, Sarah remained behind to study the satellite imagery more carefully. She wanted to make sure she hadn't overlooked any critical details that could compromise the mission. As she worked, she became aware that someone else had stayed behind. She turned to see a woman in Army uniform standing near the door. The woman was older, probably in her early 40s, with Colonel's eagles on her shoulders and a bearing that suggested significant combat experience. Sarah recognized her from the briefing, Colonel Martinez, who commanded a Special Operations Aviation Unit. Impressive analysis, Lieutenant, Colonel Martinez said as she approached. I've been in Special Operations for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of smart officers. But what you demonstrated, and there was something different. Thank you, ma'am, Sarah replied. I just try to approach problems from multiple angles. Colonel Martinez smiled. That's exactly what I mean. Most officers, especially junior ones, tend to think linearly. They see a problem and look for the most direct solution. You saw the same problem and immediately began thinking in 3 dimensions, considering factors that the rest of us missed entirely. She paused, studying Sarah carefully. Can I ask you something personal? Of course, ma'am. How do you handle the pressure of being, one of the first women in these roles. I've been dealing with it my entire career, but I imagine it's even more challenging for someone in your position. Sarah considered the question carefully. It's definitely challenging, she admitted. Every decision I make, every word I speak, feels like it's being evaluated not just on its own merits, but as a reflection of whether women belong in these roles. The margin for error is essentially zero. And how do you deal with that pressure? I focus on the mission, Sarah said simply. When I'm analyzing a tactical problem or planning an operation, gender becomes irrelevant. What matters is finding the best solution and executing it flawlessly. I found that competence speaks louder than any argument about women's capabilities. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude. But be prepared. As you advance in rank, the challenges will only get more complex. There will be situations where your expertise is questioned not because of any deficiency on your part, but simply because some people can't accept that a woman might know more than they do about warfare. I understand, ma'am. I've already encountered some of that. I'm sure you have. But I want you to remember something. You're not just fighting for your own career. Every barrier you break, every stereotype you shatter, makes it easier for the women who come after you. That's both an honor and a responsibility. Before Sarah could respond, Captain Morrison returned to the briefing room with several other senior officers. His expression was serious but determined. Lieutenant Shun, he said, I've reviewed your tactical analysis with my staff, and we're prepared to move forward with a modified version of your plan. However, there's one significant change. Given the complexity of this operation and your unique expertise in the tactical approach we'll be using, you'll be serving as the mission's tactical coordinator. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. Sir, I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to make sure I understand the scope of that role. You'll be responsible for overseeing the technical aspects of the infiltration, coordinating with the operators on the ground, and making real-time tactical adjustments as the situation develops. It's a significant responsibility, especially for an officer of your rank, but your analysis today demonstrated that you have the strategic thinking necessary for this kind of operation. The weight of the assignment settled on Sarah's shoulders. She was about to become one of the youngest officers ever to coordinate a direct action mission of this magnitude. The success or failure of the operation and the lives of the operators involved would largely depend on her decisions. I understand, sir. When do we deploy? Mission launch is scheduled for 0300 hours tomorrow. You'll have the rest of today to finalize your tactical plans and coordinate with the team leaders. Lieutenant Rodriguez will be leading the SEAL element. Staff Sergeant Williams will command the Marine component, and you'll have technical support from our best electronic warfare specialists. As Captain Morrison outlined the final mission parameters, Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the calm focus that always came over her when facing a significant challenge. This was what she had trained for her entire career. All the doubts, all the skeptical looks, all the questions about whether women belonged in combat roles would be answered by her performance over the next 24 hours. The briefing concluded with final assignments and timing details. As the senior officers left to begin their preparations, Sarah remained behind to review the mission timeline one more time. She wanted to make absolutely certain that every aspect of her plan could be executed flawlessly under combat conditions. As she worked, she thought about her parents back in Oregon, who still worried about her safety every time she deployed. They had never fully understood her drive to serve in the most dangerous roles the military offered, but they supported her choices unconditionally. Her father, despite his initial concerns, had become her biggest champion, proudly telling anyone who would listen about his daughter's accomplishments. Her mother had given her a piece of advice before her first deployment that had stayed with her through every challenging moment. Remember, sweetheart, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and trust yourself. As Sarah finalized her mission plans, she felt the familiar mix of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every major operation. Tomorrow night, she would find out if her tactical analysis could hold up under the pressure of real combat conditions. More importantly, she would discover whether she had what it took to lead elite warriors into one of the most dangerous missions any of them had ever undertaken. The sun was setting over Coronado as Sarah completed her preparations. In less than 12 hours, she would be airborne, heading toward a compound in the mountains of Belarus where failure could mean not just the loss of American lives, but the escape of a terrorist responsible for the deaths of innocent civilians. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah felt ready. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this, when everything she had learned and trained for would be put to the ultimate test. Tomorrow, she would find out if she was truly ready to lead in the world's most elite military units. The answer to that question would determine not just the success of this mission, but the trajectory of her entire career. As she walked back to her quarters to get a few hours of rest before the mission briefing, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that small town in Oregon. Tomorrow, she would be coordinating a complex special operations mission halfway around the world, responsible for decisions that could affect international security. It was a responsibility that both humbled and energized her. The night air was cool as she reached her quarters, and Sarah took a moment to look up at the stars. Somewhere under those same stars, a terrorist was preparing for what he believed would be another successful attack on American interests. He had no idea that a small team of elite operators was about to demonstrate that there was no place on Earth where those who targeted innocent Americans could hide. Sarah entered her quarters and began her final pre-mission preparations. Tomorrow would bring challenges she had never faced before, but she was as ready as she could be. The girl from small-town Oregon who had dreamed of serving her country was about to become a leader in the most elite military operations in the world. The transport aircraft cut through the darkness at 30,000 feet, its engines humming with the steady rhythm that had become familiar to Sarah during her years of military service. But this flight was different from any she had taken before. This time, she wasn't just another passenger heading to a deployment. She was the tactical coordinator for one of the most sensitive special operations missions the United States had conducted in recent years. Sarah adjusted her tactical headset and reviewed the final intelligence updates on her ruggedized tablet. The target compound in Belarus showed no signs of increased activity, which was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it suggested their mission planning had not been compromised. Concerning because terrorists who were confident enough to maintain normal routines often had contingencies that intelligence agencies hadn't discovered. Across from her in the aircraft's cargo bay, the 6 operators who would be conducting the infiltration checked and rechecked their specialized equipment. Each man was a veteran of dozens of combat missions, but the gear they carried tonight was unlike anything they had used before. The mountaineering equipment alone weighed nearly 40 pounds per operator, and that was in addition to their standard tactical loadout. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the SEAL team leader, looked up from his equipment check and caught Sarah's eye. At first glance, Rodriguez was exactly what Central Casting would order for a Navy SEAL. 6 feet 3 inches tall, broad shoulders, arms that looked like they could bend steel, and a face marked by scars that told stories of close-quarters combat in places most people couldn't find on a map. Based on the latest weather updates, you'll have approximately 23 minutes from the time you clear the aircraft until the moon position makes your approach route visible from the compound. Staff Sergeant Williams, the Marine Force recon operator who would be handling the electronic warfare aspects of the mission, leaned into the conversation. Williams was smaller than Rodriguez, but moved with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of moving unseen through hostile territory. His specialty was disabling sophisticated security systems without triggering alarms, a skill that would be crucial to the mission's success. "Ma'am, what's our contingency if the electronic surveillance system has been upgraded since our last intelligence assessment?" Williams asked. Some of these newer systems have redundancies that might not show up on satellite reconnaissance. It was exactly the kind of question that separated elite operators from regular military personnel. Williams wasn't just thinking about executing his assigned task. He was considering variables that could compromise the entire mission and planning accordingly. Excellent question, Sarah replied, switching to a different screen on her tablet. I've been working with the intelligence team on exactly that scenario. If the surveillance system proves more sophisticated than anticipated, we have two backup options. First, we can extend the timeline and conduct additional reconnaissance to identify new vulnerabilities. Second, if time doesn't permit extended recon, we can shift to a direct action approach using the northern ravine as cover. Rodriguez studied the alternative approach route on Sarah's screen. The northern ravine would get us closer to the target building, but it also increases our exposure time in the compound's interior perimeter. Correct, Sarah agreed. That's why it's the backup plan rather than the primary approach. But if we have to use it, the key advantage is that it brings you within 50 meters of the primary target's probable location, which could allow for mission completion even if full infiltration isn't possible. The aircraft commander's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were approaching the drop zone. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that always preceded high-stakes operations, but her mind remained clear and focused. This was the culmination of months of preparation, and she was confident that her tactical plan could succeed under real-world conditions. The operators began their final equipment checks with the methodical precision that comes from years of training. Every piece of gear was tested, every backup system verified, every contingency reviewed one final time. In special operations, there were no second chances, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Sarah activated her communications array and established contact with a command center back in the United States. The secure satellite link would allow her to coordinate with intelligence analysts, senior commanders, and technical specialists throughout the mission. More importantly, it would enable her to make real-time tactical adjustments based on information that might not be available to the operators on the ground. Command, this is Blackbird Actual. Sarah spoke into her headset microphone. Team is prepared for insertion. Weather conditions are optimal, and all systems are green. The response came immediately from Captain Morrison, who was monitoring the mission from SOCOM headquarters. Blackbird Actual, command copies all green. You are cleared for mission execution. Good hunting. The aircraft began its descent toward the drop zone, a remote valley approximately 15 kilometers from the target compound. The insertion would be conducted using high-altitude, low-opening parachute techniques, allowing the team to approach their objective without being detected by radar systems or ground observers. As the aircraft leveled off at the drop altitude, Sarah reviewed her tactical timeline one final time. The operators would have exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes to reach the compound, execute the infiltration, locate and capture the target, and move to the extraction point. Any delay beyond that timeline would put them at risk of being compromised by morning patrol activities that intelligence indicated began before dawn. Rodriguez and his team stood and began their final pre-jump procedures. Each operator wore specialized equipment that allowed them to navigate in complete darkness while maintaining communication with Sarah and with each other. The technology represented the cutting edge of military innovation, but its effectiveness would ultimately depend on the skill and judgment of the men who used it. Blackbird team, final communications check, Sarah announced. One by one, each operator confirmed that his radio system was functioning properly and that he could receive both Sarah's tactical coordination and the navigation data being transmitted from the aircraft systems. The aircraft's jumpmaster, a seasoned Air Force Special Operations veteran, began the final countdown to insertion. Sarah watched as Rodriguez and his team positioned themselves at the aircraft's rear cargo door, which was already open to the night sky. The wind noise was tremendous, but the operators seemed completely at ease, their years of training evident in every movement. 60 seconds, the jumpmaster announced. Sarah activated her tactical coordination system, which would allow her to track the team's movement throughout the mission and provide real-time intelligence updates. Her screen showed the compound layout, weather conditions, intelligence assessments, and, most importantly, the GPS positions of each team member once they reached the ground. 30 seconds. The operators performed their final equipment checks with movements so practiced they appeared almost ritualistic. Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye and gave her a slight nod, a gesture that conveyed both confidence in her tactical plan and acknowledgement of the responsibility they were sharing. 10 seconds. Stand by. Sarah watched as the 6 operators stepped into the darkness, disappearing instantly into the night sky. For the next several hours, their lives would depend on the tactical plan she had developed and her ability to coordinate their movements in response to changing conditions on the ground. The aircraft immediately began climbing to a higher altitude, where it would remain in position to monitor the mission and provide extraction support if needed. Sarah settled into her coordination station and activated all of her monitoring systems. The real work was just beginning. 12 minutes after insertion, the team confirmed successful landing and began their approach to the target. Sarah tracked their movement on her tactical display, watching as 6 green dots moved across the terrain toward the compound. Their pace was steady, but careful, exactly what she had planned for in her timeline calculations. The first challenge came 37 minutes into the mission. Williams, the Marine handling electronic surveillance, detected a patrol pattern that hadn't appeared in the pre-mission intelligence briefings. A 2-man security team was conducting roving patrols outside the compound's main perimeter, potentially compromising the team's planned approach route. Blackbird Actual, this is Romeo 2, Williams whispered over the radio. I've got 2 hostiles conducting foot patrol approximately 200 meters south of our intended route. Patrol pattern appears to be irregular, no fixed timing. Sarah immediately pulled up additional intelligence data and consulted her tactical maps. The patrol team represented a significant complication, but not one she hadn't anticipated. During mission planning, she had identified several alternative approach routes specifically for situations like this. Romeo 2, Blackbird Actual copies. Switch to approach route Charlie is briefed. That route will add approximately 14 minutes to your timeline, but it maintains concealment from the patrol area. Romeo 2 copies approach route Charlie. Sarah watched as the team adjusted their movement, following the alternative path she had identified during mission planning. The route took them through more difficult terrain, but it allowed them to maintain the element of surprise that was crucial to mission success. As the team navigated the new approach route, Sarah coordinated with intelligence analysts back in the United States to gather additional information about the patrol team. Within minutes, she had confirmation that the patrols were likely a recent addition to the compound security, probably implemented within the last 72 hours. This intelligence was both good news and bad news. Good news because it suggested that the compound's defenders were not aware of the specific threat posed by the incoming American team. Bad news because any recent changes to security procedures increased the risk that other aspects of the compound's defenses might have been modified as well. Command, this is Blackbird Actual, Sarah reported to the headquarters team monitoring the mission. Target has implemented additional security measures not reflected in pre-mission intelligence. Recommend we accelerate timeline for future similar operations to minimize risk of defensive improvements. Blackbird Actual command copies. Continue mission execution. An hour and 23 minutes into the mission, the team reached the ridgeline that would allow them to begin the technical climbing phase of the operation. This was the most dangerous part of Sarah's tactical plan, a controlled descent down a near vertical rock face in complete darkness, while carrying full tactical equipment and maintaining absolute silence. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, barely above a whisper. Blackbird Actual, we're in position for vertical phase. Compound is visible approximately 400 meters northeast. No visible activity on our approach vector. Sarah checked her tactical displays and confirmed that all environmental conditions remained within acceptable parameters for the climbing portion of the mission. Wind speed was minimal, temperature was stable, and, most importantly, the cloud cover was providing additional concealment from any potential observation. Romeo 1, you are cleared for vertical phase. Estimated time to target perimeter is 47 minutes based on current conditions. What happened next would determine whether months of planning and preparation had been sufficient to overcome one of the most challenging tactical situations American Special Operations Forces had attempted in recent years. Sarah watched her tactical displays as 6 green dots began their descent toward the terrorist compound, each representing an elite warrior whose life depended on the accuracy of her analysis and the soundness of her plan. The climbing phase proceeded flawlessly for the first 30 minutes. Each operator descended the rock face using techniques that had been perfected through countless hours of training in similar terrain. Their movement was so controlled and precise that motion detectors positioned throughout the area showed no indication of their presence. But as they approached the compound's outer perimeter, Sarah detected a problem that threatened to compromise the entire mission. Her electronic monitoring systems indicated that the compound's backup power generators had been activated, suggesting that someone inside was conducting maintenance on the primary electrical systems. If the backup generators were running, Williams would not be able to disable the surveillance systems using the method Sarah had planned. The electronic warfare approach she had developed depended on the surveillance network being powered by the main electrical grid, which had specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The backup generators had different characteristics that would require a completely different approach. Romeo 2, Blackbird Actual. I'm detecting backup power activation at the target. This changes your approach to the surveillance systems. Stand by for updated instructions. Sarah immediately began calculating alternative methods for disabling the compound's electronic defenses. Her training in electronic warfare systems paid off as she identified a secondary vulnerability that could still be exploited, but it would require Williams to reach a different location within the compound and use different techniques. Romeo 2, new plan for surveillance systems. Instead of targeting the main generators, you'll need to reach the communication relay station on the compound's east side. From there, you can introduce a signal disruption that should disable the cameras without triggering the backup alarms. Williams acknowledged the change, but Sarah could hear the tension in his voice. Reaching the communication relay would require him to move through an area that provided less cover and increase the risk of detection. It was exactly the kind of real-time tactical adjustment that separated successful special operations from missions that ended in disaster. As Williams began his movement toward the new target, Sarah coordinated with the intelligence team to gather more information about the compound's communication systems. She needed to make sure that the signal disruption technique would work against whatever equipment the terrorists were using. The next 23 minutes were the longest of Sarah's military career. She watched as Williams moved through the compound's interior, avoiding guard positions and security cameras while carrying equipment that could disable the surveillance network. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the entire team would be compromised. Finally, Williams reached the communication relay station. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 2 is in position. Beginning signal disruption sequence. Sarah held her breath as Williams worked to disable the surveillance systems using techniques that had never been tested under actual combat conditions. Her tactical plan had required adaptation and modification, but the fundamental approach remained sound. If Williams could succeed in disabling the cameras, the team would have their window to complete the mission. Signal disruption successful, Williams reported. Surveillance network is down. Estimated time before backup systems activate is 6 minutes and 43 seconds. The clock was now running. Rodriguez and the other operators had less than 7 minutes to reach the building where intelligence suggested the terrorist leader was located, secure the target, and begin their movement to the extraction point. Sarah tracked their movement as they crossed the compound's main courtyard, moving like shadows between buildings and vehicles. Their training and her tactical coordination had brought them to this moment, the culmination of one of the most complex special operations missions ever attempted by American forces. But as Rodriguez approached the target building, Sarah detected movement on her sensors that made her blood run cold. Additional heat signatures were moving within the compound, far more than intelligence had suggested would be present. The terrorist leader hadn't just upgraded his security procedures. He had significantly increased the number of personnel protecting him. The mission was about to become far more complicated and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Sarah stared at her tactical display in disbelief. Instead of the 15 to 20 personnel that intelligence had predicted, her sensors were now detecting at least 35 heat signatures scattered throughout the compound. The terrorist leader had clearly anticipated the possibility of an attack and had significantly reinforced his security forces. Romeo 1, Blackbird Actual, Sarah whispered into her microphone, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. I'm reading multiple additional hostiles throughout the target area. Count is now 3-5 plus, repeat, 3-5 plus armed personnel. Rodriguez's response was immediate but controlled. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 1 copies 3-5 plus. Recommend we abort and extract to alternate landing zone. For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like a physical force. The safe decision, the one that any reasonable officer would make, was to call off the mission and extract the team before they could be detected. The odds had shifted dramatically against them, and continuing the operation would put 6 elite operators at enormous risk. But Sarah also knew something that Rodriguez couldn't see from his position on the ground. The intelligence intercepts that had led to this mission indicated that the terrorist leader was planning an attack on American civilians within the next 48 hours. If they extracted now, those innocent people would likely die, and the opportunity to capture one of the world's most dangerous terrorists might not come again for years. Romeo 1, hold your position, Sarah transmitted. I'm analyzing the new tactical situation. Stand by. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. The traditional approach to the mission was no longer viable with so many additional hostile personnel in the area. But her years of studying asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics suggested there might be another way to accomplish their objectives. She pulled up detailed floor plans of the target building and cross-referenced them with the heat signature data from her sensors. Most of the additional personnel appeared to be guards positioned in the compound's outer areas, which suggested that the terrorist leader was still in the central building where intelligence had placed him. More importantly, the positioning of the guards indicated that they were primarily focused on preventing infiltration from outside the compound. They had not positioned themselves to defend against threats that had already penetrated the perimeter and were operating from within. Romeo 2, Sarah transmitted to Williams. What's your assessment of the surveillance system status? How long before the backup cameras come back online? Williams checked his equipment quickly. Blackbird Actual, I got approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds before the surveillance network resets. After that, anyone moving in the compound will be visible to the security center. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. It wasn't much time, but Sarah was beginning to see a way to turn the terrorists' increased security measures against them. The key was to use the confusion and overlapping responsibilities that always occurred when too many guards were trying to protect the same area. Romeo 1, new tactical plan, Sarah transmitted. Instead of avoiding the guards, we're going to use them as cover for our approach. Here's what I need you to do. Sarah outlined a radical modification to the mission plan that would have been impossible with a smaller security force, but became feasible with so many guards present. Instead of trying to move unseen through the compound, Rodriguez and his team would create deliberate distractions that would cause the guards to respond in predictable ways, opening corridors of movement that hadn't existed in the original plan. Romeo 3 and Romeo 4, Sarah continued, addressing the 2 operators who specialized in demolitions and psychological operations. I need you to create the impression of an attack on the compound's south wall. Nothing that will cause casualties, but enough noise and apparent threat to draw guards away from the central building. The plan was audacious and risky, but it offered their best chance of completing the mission despite the unexpected complications. Sarah was essentially gambling that her understanding of human psychology and tactical behavior was accurate enough to predict how the guards would respond to a perceived external threat. Romeo 5 and Romeo 6 will use the diversion to approach the target building from the north, while Romeo 1 and Romeo 2 complete the surveillance system shutdown and move to secure the primary objective. Rodriguez paused before responding. Sarah could almost hear him thinking through the implications of what she was proposing. Blackbird Actual, that plan puts us inside the compound's inner perimeter during active hostile response. Extraction will be significantly more complicated. Acknowledged, Romeo 1. But the alternative is mission abort with high probability that the target will relocate before we can attempt another operation. Given the intelligence about planned attacks on civilian targets, I assess that mission completion justifies the increased risk. There was another pause, longer this time. Then, Rodriguez's voice came back, calm and determined. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 1 copies new plan. Team is prepared to execute on your command. Sarah felt a surge of pride and responsibility. These elite warriors were trusting her tactical judgment, even when it required them to take extraordinary risks. The success or failure of the mission, and potentially the survival of the team, now depended entirely on whether her analysis of the situation was correct. All Romeo elements. Execute diversionary phase in 30 seconds. Romeo 3 and 4 initiate diversion on the south wall. All other elements move to assigned positions. Sarah watched her tactical display as the team began to implement her modified plan. Romeo 3 and 4 moved toward the compound's southern perimeter, carrying small explosive charges that would create the sound and flash of incoming mortar rounds without actually causing structural damage to the compound. Meanwhile, Romeo 5 and 6 began their movement toward the target building, using routes that would be concealed from the guard's view once the diversion began and drew attention toward the south wall. Diversion initiating in 10 seconds, Romeo 3 reported. Sarah held her breath as she watched the culmination of months of planning and years of training come down to a few critical seconds. If her psychological assessment was wrong, if the guards responded differently than she anticipated, the entire team could be trapped inside a compound full of armed terrorists with no clear escape route. The explosions lit up Sarah's infrared sensors as Romeo 3 and 4 detonated their charges against the compound's south wall. The blasts were perfectly calibrated, loud enough to sound like incoming mortar fire, bright enough to suggest a serious attack, but not destructive enough to actually breach the compound's defenses. The response was immediate and exactly what Sarah had predicted. Guards throughout the compound began moving toward the south wall, shouting orders and preparing to repel what they believed was an assault by a larger force. In their haste to respond to the apparent external threat, they left corridors of movement that hadn't existed moments before. Romeo 5 and 6, you have clear approach to target building. Guards have moved to respond to diversion. Sarah tracked the two operators as they moved swiftly across the compound's central area, reaching the target building just as the surveillance cameras began coming back online. Their timing was perfect. They were already inside the building before the electronic eyes that could have detected them were functional again. Romeo 1 and 2, surveillance systems are resetting. You need to reach the target building now. Rodriguez and Williams broke cover and moved quickly across the compound. The remaining guards were focused on the continuing sounds of explosions from the south wall, where Romeo 3 and 4 were maintaining the illusion of an ongoing attack. The psychological principle Sarah had counted on was working perfectly. When people believe they're under attack, they focus on the perceived threat and miss other activities happening around them. Romeo 1 is inside target building, Rodriguez reported as he and Williams reached their objective, beginning search for a primary target. Now came the most critical phase of the mission. Sarah's tactical plan had successfully gotten the team inside the building where the terrorist leader was believed to be located, but finding and securing him would require different skills and potentially different tactics. Romeo 1. Intelligence suggests primary target is located on the second floor, eastern section of the building. Be advised that he may have personal security detail with him. Copy second floor, eastern section. Sarah monitored the team's progress through the building using a combination of motion sensors, heat signature tracking, and the whispered reports from the operators themselves. The building was larger and more complex than satellite imagery had suggested, with multiple rooms and corridors that could potentially hide armed defenders. Contact, second floor, Rodriguez reported suddenly. 2 armed hostiles in corridor outside target room. Engaging. Sarah heard the muffled sounds of suppressed weapon fire through Rodriguez's microphone. The team was using weapons designed to minimize noise, but any gunfire inside the building increased the risk that guards outside would realize the real threat was coming from within the compound, rather than from the diversionary attack at the south wall. Romeo 3 and 4 increased diversion intensity. We need to maintain guard focus on the south wall. The explosions from the south wall grew louder and more frequent as Romeo 3 and 4 escalated their diversionary attacks. Sarah was asking them to maintain an extremely dangerous deception. They had to create the impression of a serious assault without actually providing targets for the guards to engage. Hostiles neutralized, Rodriguez reported. Moving to target room. Romeo 1, be advised that backup surveillance systems are now fully online. Any movement in the compound will be visible to Security Center. This was the crucial moment Sarah had been planning for. The team had successfully infiltrated the building and was about to attempt capture of the primary target, but they were now operating in an environment where every move could be detected by the compound security systems. Target acquired, Rodriguez announced suddenly. 1 military-age male, matching target description, conscious and cooperative. No additional hostile personnel in immediate area. Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. The months of planning, the complex tactical modifications, and the risks taken by 6 elite operators had paid off. They had successfully located and captured one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. But the mission was far from over. Now they had to extract from the compound while carrying a prisoner, with 30-plus armed guards becoming increasingly aware that the real threat was inside their perimeter rather than attacking from outside. Romeo 1, excellent work. Begin movement to extraction point Alpha. Romeo 3 and 4 prepare to shift diversion to support extraction route. As Rodriguez and Williams began moving their prisoner toward the extraction point, Sarah started coordinating the complex sequence of actions that would be required to get the entire team safely out of the compound. The psychological deception that had enabled them to complete their primary mission would now have to be maintained long enough for them to escape. Blackbird Actual, this is Romeo 5, came an urgent transmission. Guards are beginning to move back toward the central compound. I think they're starting to realize the south wall attack is a diversion. Sarah's heart rate increased as she processed this information. The terrorists' initial response had followed her psychological predictions perfectly, but they were apparently more tactically sophisticated than she had anticipated. Someone in their command structure was beginning to question whether the attack on the south wall represented the real threat. All Romeo elements, expedite movement to extraction point Alpha. Diversion is beginning to lose effectiveness. Sarah watched her tactical display as all 6 operators began moving toward the designated extraction point, but she could see that they weren't going to make it out of the compound before the guards realized where the real threat was located. The terrorist security forces were already beginning to reposition themselves to search the compound's interior. In approximately 90 seconds, Rodriguez and his team were going to find themselves trapped inside a compound with more than 30 armed guards who knew that enemy forces were operating somewhere within their perimeter. The extraction that Sarah had planned for a covert exfiltration was about to become a fighting withdrawal under the worst possible circumstances. Sarah had approximately 1 minute to develop a new tactical plan that could get 6 operators and their prisoners safely out of a hostile compound that was about to be locked down by an overwhelming number of enemy forces. The success of the most important mission of her career now depended on her ability to think faster and more creatively than she ever had before. The girl from Oregon who had dreamed of serving her country was about to face the ultimate test of her tactical abilities, and her courage under fire. Sarah's mind moved at lightning speed as she calculated distances, timing, and tactical possibilities. The extraction point that had seemed reasonable during mission planning was now impossible to reach without fighting through multiple guard positions. But surrendering wasn't an option, not when they had the terrorist leader in custody and civilian lives hung in the balance. Romeo 1, Blackbird Actual. Original extraction point is compromised. I'm designating emergency extraction point Bravo, the maintenance shed where you disabled the generators. From there, we'll implement vertical extraction using the cliff face. Rodriguez's response was immediate. Blackbird Actual. Vertical extraction with prisoner will be extremely difficult. We're talking about a controlled rappel down a near-vertical rock face in hostile territory while carrying an uncooperative subject. Sarah was already working through the technical challenges. Romeo 1, I understand the complications, but it's our only viable option. The compound is being locked down, and any ground-based extraction route will put you in direct contact with superior numbers of hostile forces. As she spoke, Sarah was coordinating with the extraction support team orbiting high above the compound. The modified helicopter that had been standing by for emergency extraction was equipped with specialized equipment for vertical operations, but using it would require precise timing and perfect execution under combat conditions. Romeo 3 and 4 New Mission. I need you to create a corridor of distraction between Romeo 1's current position and the maintenance shed. Maximum noise and confusion, but maintain your own extraction capability. The two operators acknowledged immediately and began moving to positions where they could provide the cover that Rodriguez's team would need. Sarah watched her tactical display as all the pieces of her improvised plan began moving into position. Extraction support. This is Blackbird Actual. We need immediate vertical extraction capability at emergency point Bravo. Team of 6+1 prisoner. Hostile environment. Time critical. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the secure communication channel. Blackbird Actual. Extraction support copies vertical extraction at emergency point Bravo. Be advised that helicopter exposure time will be significant due to terrain requirements. Sarah understood the implications. The helicopter would have to hover in a vulnerable position while the operators rappelled to safety, making it a target for any guards with heavy weapons. But the alternative was allowing the team to be captured or killed, which was unacceptable. Romeo 1, begin movement to emergency extraction point Bravo. Romeo 3 and 4 provide covering distractions. Rodriguez and Williams began moving through the compound with their prisoner, a bearded man in his 40s whose calm demeanor suggested he understood the significance of his capture. The terrorist leader showed no signs of panic or resistance, which made Sarah wonder if he had contingency plans that her intelligence hadn't discovered. As the team moved toward the maintenance shed, Sarah detected new movement on her tactical display that made her blood run cold. A convoy of vehicles was approaching the compound from the south, reinforcements that intelligence had not anticipated. All Romeo elements, be advised that hostile reinforcements are approaching from the south. Estimated arrival time, 8 minutes. This significantly compresses our extraction timeline. The approaching reinforcements changed everything. What had been a challenging extraction was now becoming a race against time that would test every skill the operators possessed. Sarah realized that her tactical plan would need one final modification to account for this new threat. Romeo 3 and 4, I need you to delay the incoming convoy without compromising your own extraction. Use terrain to your advantage and create the impression of a larger force. Sarah was asking the two operators to take on a convoy of unknown size with just their personal weapons and whatever explosives they still carried. It was exactly the kind of mission that special operations personnel trained for, but hoped they would never have to execute. Meanwhile, Rodriguez and Williams had reached the maintenance shed with their prisoner. The building provided temporary concealment, but it was also a potential trap if hostile forces surrounded it before the extraction could be completed. Romeo 1, Blackbird Actual. Extraction support will be in position in 3 minutes. Prepare for vertical extraction procedures. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 1 copies. Prisoner is secured and ready for vertical movement. Be advised that hostiles are beginning to concentrate on this area of the compound. Sarah could see the tactical situation deteriorating with each passing moment. Guards throughout the compound were moving toward the maintenance shed, apparently having realized that the earlier diversions were exactly that. Diversions meant to conceal the real operation. Romeo 5 and 6, I need you to establish overwatch positions to cover the extraction. Priority targets are any hostiles with heavy weapons or communications equipment. The two operators immediately began moving to elevated positions around the maintenance shed where they could provide covering fire during the extraction phase. Their job was to keep hostile forces far enough away that the helicopter could complete its mission without being shot down. Convoy is engaging Romeo 3 and 4, Williams reported suddenly. Multiple vehicles, heavy weapons. Romeo 3 and 4 are requesting immediate extraction support. Sarah felt the weight of command as she realized that she was about to have operators in contact with hostile forces in 2 separate locations simultaneously. The extraction helicopter could only be in one place at a time, which meant she would have to prioritize who got extracted first. Extraction support. Be advised we have troops in contact at 2 locations. Prioritize vertical extraction at Emergency Point Bravo, then immediate movement to support Romeo 3 and 4. It was one of the hardest decisions Sarah had ever made. Romeo 3 and 4 were outnumbered and outgunned, facing a convoy of unknown size with limited ammunition and no cover. But the primary mission was to extract the terrorist leader, and that had to take priority even if it meant putting 2 operators at extreme risk. Romeo 3 and 4, hold your positions and continue delaying actions. Extraction support will reach your location immediately after primary extraction is complete. The response from Romeo 3 was calm despite the circumstances. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 3 copies. We'll keep them busy. Sarah heard the sound of automatic weapons fire in the background of Romeo 3's transmission, confirming that the 2 operators were now in direct combat with superior numbers of enemy forces. Every second of delay in the primary extraction meant increased danger for Romeo 3 and 4. Extraction support. Expedite approach to Emergency Point Bravo. We have operators in contact, and time is critical. Blackbird Actual, extraction support is 2 minutes out. Prepare team for immediate vertical extraction upon arrival. Rodriguez began preparing the extraction equipment, while Williams maintained security and control of the prisoner. The terrorist leader remained calm and cooperative, which continued to concern Sarah. Men who had spent years evading capture by the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies didn't usually surrender without some kind of backup plan. Romeo 1, be extremely cautious with the prisoner. His demeanor suggests possible contingencies we haven't identified. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 1 copies. Prisoner is secured and searched, but recommend enhanced security measures during extraction. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors filled the air as the extraction aircraft moved into position above the compound. Sarah watched her tactical display as the pilot maneuvered the aircraft into the precise position required for vertical extraction from the maintenance shed area. All Romeo elements. Extraction aircraft is in position. Romeo 1, begin immediate extraction procedures. Rodriguez secured the terrorist leader to the extraction harness while Williams provided security. The procedure was complex and dangerous under ideal conditions, but executing it while under fire from multiple hostile positions pushed the boundaries of what even elite operators could accomplish. First extraction package ready, Rodriguez reported. Prisoner and 1 operator prepared for vertical movement. Extraction support, Lift first package now. Sarah watched as the helicopter's winch system lifted Rodriguez and the terrorist leader from the compound, carrying them up through the darkness toward the aircraft hovering overhead. But as they reached the halfway point, Sarah detected muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the compound. The guards had finally located the extraction site and were engaging the helicopter with small arms fire. The aircraft shuddered as bullets struck its armored hull, but the pilot maintained position long enough for Rodriguez and the prisoner to reach safety. First package secure, the extraction pilot reported, moving to extract remaining personnel. But as the helicopter began lowering the harness for Williams, Sarah's sensors detected something that changed everything. The terrorist leader's calm demeanor finally made sense. He had been carrying a concealed transmitter that was now broadcasting their location to additional enemy forces. Extraction support, be advised that prisoner was carrying tracking device. Recommend immediate departure before additional hostile forces can respond to signal. The pilot's voice was tense but professional. Blackbird Actual, understand tracking device. Can complete extraction of remaining personnel, but exposure time will be significant. Sarah faced another impossible decision. She could order the helicopter to depart immediately with the primary target secured, ensuring mission success, but leaving 4 operators behind in a compound that was about to be swarming with additional hostile forces. Or she could continue the extraction and risk losing both the captured terrorist leader and the extraction aircraft. Extraction support, continue extraction operations. We don't leave anyone behind. It was a fundamental principle of American special operations. No matter what the risk, you never abandon fellow operators in hostile territory. Sarah was willing to risk the entire mission rather than break that sacred trust. Romeo 2. Prepare for extraction, Sarah commanded as the helicopter lowered its harness toward Williams's position. But before Williams could attach himself to the extraction system, Sarah's sensors detected incoming rocket fire from one of the newly arrived hostile vehicles. Someone in the compound had finally brought heavy weapons to bear on the extraction site. Extraction support, incoming RPG fire. Take evasive action immediately. The helicopter pilot reacted instantly, pulling up and away from the compound just as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded in the exact location where the aircraft had been hovering moments before. The blast sent debris flying in all directions and filled the air with smoke and dust. Extraction support to Blackbird Actual. Aircraft has sustained damage from blast effects. Assessing capability to continue extraction operations. Sarah realized that her carefully planned mission had just become a desperate fight for survival. 4 elite operators were trapped in a compound filled with hostile forces. The extraction aircraft was damaged and might not be able to continue operations, and enemy reinforcements were continuing to arrive. The girl from Oregon who had been trusted to coordinate one of the most sensitive operations in recent American military history was about to discover whether she had what it took to bring her people home against impossible odds. The damaged helicopter struggled to maintain altitude as its pilot fought to assess the aircraft's condition while remaining within extraction range of the operators still trapped in the compound. Sarah could hear the strain in the pilot's voice as he reported his status. Blackbird Actual, extraction support. We've lost hydraulic pressure in the primary flight control system and taken damage to the tail rotor assembly. Aircraft is flyable, but extraction capabilities are severely limited. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The helicopter could still fly, but it might not be able to hover in the precise position required for vertical extraction operations. And with enemy forces now equipped with heavy weapons actively engaging the aircraft, any attempt to continue the extraction would put both the aircrew and the remaining operators at extreme risk. But Sarah also knew that Romeo 2, Romeo 5, Romeo 6, Romeo 3, and Romeo 4 were counting on her to find a way to bring them home. These men had trusted her tactical judgment throughout the mission, following her plans even when those plans required them to take extraordinary risks. She couldn't abandon them now. Romeo 2, Blackbird Actual. Extraction aircraft is damaged, but operational. We're going to modify extraction procedures to account for aircraft limitations. Williams responded immediately from his position near the maintenance shed, where hostile fire was becoming increasingly intense. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 2 copies. Were the new procedures. Sarah was already working through alternative extraction methods that could work with a damaged aircraft operating in a hostile environment. The traditional vertical extraction was no longer possible, but her knowledge of unconventional tactics suggested another approach that might work. Romeo 2, instead of vertical extraction from your current position, I need you to move to the compound's north wall. Extraction support will conduct a low-level approach from the valley, allowing for lateral extraction using fast rope techniques. It was a dangerous plan that would require the damaged helicopter to fly at extremely low altitude through terrain that provided minimal maneuvering room. But it was the only approach that could work given the aircraft's current limitations and the increasing hostile fire around the compound. Romeo 5 and 6 provide covering fire to enable Romeo 2's movement to the north wall. Priority targets are any hostiles with heavy weapons or direct line of sight to the extraction route. The two operators in Overwatch positions immediately began engaging hostile forces throughout the compound, their precise marksmanship creating corridors of movement that Williams could use to reach the new extraction point. Sarah tracked his progress on her tactical display as he moved through the compound under fire. Meanwhile, Romeo 3 and 4 still engaged with the hostile convoy south of the compound, using hit-and-run tactics to delay the reinforcements while conserving their limited ammunition. Sarah knew that they were fighting against time as much as against enemy forces. Eventually, they would run out of ammunition or be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Romeo 3 and 4 status report. How long can you maintain current operations? Romeo 3's response was punctuated by the sound of gunfire. Blackbird Actual, we've got approximately 15 minutes of ammunition remaining at current rate of engagement. Hostile forces appear to be attempting to flank our position. 15 minutes. Sarah realized that she had exactly 15 minutes to extract Williams from the compound's north wall, reposition the damaged helicopter to Romeo 3 and 4's location, and complete their extraction before they were overrun by superior numbers of enemy forces. Extraction support. Romeo 2 is moving to north wall for lateral extraction. After Romeo 2 is secure, immediate movement to support Romeo 3 and 4 at grid reference 7749-1. Blackbird Actual, extraction support copies. Be advised that aircraft performance is degraded. Low-level flight through the valley terrain will be extremely challenging with current damage. Sarah understood that she was asking the pilot to risk his aircraft and crew to save her operators, but she also knew that it was a risk they would willingly take. The bond between special operations personnel and their aviation support crews was forged in situations exactly like this one. Romeo 2, you're clear to move to north wall. Extraction support will begin approach in 60 seconds. Williams broke cover and began moving toward the north wall under covering fire from Romeo 5 and 6. Sarah watched his progress on her tactical display, noting how hostile forces throughout the compound were adjusting their positions to intercept him. The terrorist security forces had finally organized an effective response to the American infiltration. Contact front. Williams reported as he encountered hostile forces directly blocking his route to the extraction point. 2 armed personnel in direct path to north wall. Romeo 5, engage hostiles blocking Romeo 2's route to extraction point. The sniper positioned in Overwatch immediately engaged the 2 guards, eliminating the immediate threat to Williams's movement. But Sarah could see additional hostile forces converging on the north wall area, apparently having anticipated that the Americans would attempt extraction from that location. Romeo 2. Hostile forces are moving to intercept you at the north wall. You'll have a very narrow window for extraction once extraction support arrives. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 2 copies narrow window. The sound of the damaged helicopter approaching filled the air as the pilot conducted his low-level approach through the valley terrain. Sarah could hear the strain in the aircraft's engines as the pilot fought to maintain control with degraded flight systems while flying at dangerously low altitude. Extraction support beginning lateral extraction approach. Romeo 2. Prepare for immediate extraction on first pass. We may not be able to make a second approach. Williams reached the north wall just as the helicopter appeared over the compound's perimeter, flying so low that its rotor wash was kicking up debris from the ground. The aircraft shuddered and vibrated from its battle damage, but the pilot maintained precise control as he positioned the helicopter for Williams's extraction. Romeo 2, go now. Williams attached himself to the fast rope system and dropped from the compound wall to the helicopter in a controlled fall that lasted only seconds. The pilot immediately began climbing and turning toward Romeo 3 and 4's location as soon as Williams was secure aboard the aircraft. Romeo 2 extracted successfully, moving to support Romeo 3 and 4. But as the helicopter gained altitude, Sarah's sensors detected new threats that made her realize the mission's dangers were far from over. Additional hostile vehicles were approaching Romeo 3 and 4's position from multiple directions, and the two operators were about to be surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemy forces. Romeo 3 and 4, hostile reinforcements approaching your position from northeast and southwest. You need to begin immediate movement toward extraction point Charlie. Romeo 3's response was strained but determined. Blackbird Actual were taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Movement to extraction point will require breaking contact under fire. Breaking contact under fire was one of the most dangerous maneuvers that special operations personnel could attempt. It required precise timing, perfect coordination, and a significant amount of luck. Sarah knew that she was asking Romeo 3 and 4 to attempt something that had a high probability of failure. Romeo 3 and 4 extraction support will provide covering fire during your movement. Use smoke and rapid bounce to break contact. The damaged helicopter approached Romeo 3 and 4's position just as the two operators began their desperate attempt to reach the extraction point. Sarah watched her tactical display as green dots representing her operators moved through terrain swarming with red dots representing hostile forces. Extraction support engaging hostile vehicles with door guns, the pilot reported. Romeo 3 and 4, you have covering fire for movement. The helicopter's mounted machine guns opened fire on the hostile convoy, drawing attention away from the two operators who were moving through the terrain using every bit of cover available. But Sarah could see that the hostile forces were too numerous and too well positioned for the extraction to succeed using conventional methods. Extraction support, the extraction point, is compromised. Too many hostiles in the immediate area. Sarah realized that she needed one final tactical innovation to save Romeo 3 and 4. The conventional extraction approaches were no longer viable, but her knowledge of unconventional warfare suggested a possibility that was so audacious it might actually work. Romeo 3 and 4 new plan. Instead of moving to the extraction point, I need you to move to the highest ground in your immediate area. Extraction support will conduct a pinnacle extraction using hover techniques. A pinnacle extraction involved the helicopter hovering with just its rear wheels touching the peak of elevated terrain while operators literally ran up the slope and jumped aboard the aircraft. It was an extremely dangerous maneuver that required perfect timing and absolute trust between the aircrew and the operators on the ground. Blackbird Actual, Romeo 3 copies pinnacle extraction. Moving to high ground now. Sarah watched as Romeo 3 and 4 began climbing toward a rocky outcropping that rose above the surrounding terrain. Hostile forces were pursuing them, but the steep terrain provided some protection from the heaviest weapons while allowing the operators to use their superior climbing skills to maintain distance from their pursuers. The damaged helicopter approached the pinnacle extraction site with engines straining and damaged systems protesting. The pilot had to compensate for degraded controls while positioning the aircraft in one of the most challenging flight regimes possible for rotary wing aircraft. Extraction support in position for pinnacle extraction. Romeo 3 and 4, you need to reach the aircraft now. The two operators reached the rocky outcropping just as the helicopter settled into position with its rear wheels barely touching the uneven stone surface. They ran toward the aircraft under fire from hostile forces below, jumping aboard just as the pilot pulled up and away from the extraction site. All personnel extracted successfully, the pilot reported, departing hostile territory at best possible speed. Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction as she realized that her tactical plan had succeeded despite complications that would have defeated most military operations. 6 elite operators had successfully infiltrated one of the most heavily defended compounds in the world, captured a high-value terrorist target, and extracted safely despite being outnumbered by more than 6 to 1. But even as the helicopter carried the team towards safety, Sarah knew that the mission's success would ultimately be judged by the intelligence value of the captured terrorist leader and the attacks on American civilians that had been prevented. The tactical victory was meaningless unless it contributed to the larger strategic goal of protecting innocent lives. Command, this is Blackbird Actual. Mission complete. Primary target secured. All personnel extracted safely. Recommend immediate interrogation of captured subject to identify and disrupt planned attacks on civilian targets. Captain Morrison's response came immediately over the secure communication channel. Blackbird Actual, command copies mission complete. Outstanding work. Intelligence teams are standing by to begin interrogation procedures immediately upon your arrival. As the damaged helicopter struggled through the night sky toward friendly territory, Sarah reflected on the mission that had tested every aspect of her military training and leadership abilities. She had started the day as a young lieutenant whose tactical theories had never been tested under actual combat conditions. She was ending it as a proven special operations commander who had successfully coordinated one of the most complex missions in recent American military history. The operators around her in the helicopter's cabin sat quietly, each lost in his own thoughts about the night's events. Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that meant more to her than any formal commendation could. Sarah knew that word of the mission's success would eventually reach the highest levels of the American government and military establishment. But for now, she was content knowing that 6 brave men were safely on their way home and that a dangerous terrorist would no longer be able to threaten innocent civilians. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the briefing room at Special Operations Command Headquarters, wearing her dress blue uniform and watching as senior officers filed in for what had been described as a routine briefing on recent operations. She had no idea that Captain Morrison had recommended her for one of the military's highest decorations, or that several 4-star generals had specifically requested to meet the young officer whose tactical innovation had made the Belarus mission possible. As Sarah waited for the briefing to begin, she thought about how far she had traveled from that small town in Oregon where her journey had started. The girl who had dreamed of serving her country had become a woman whose contributions to national security would influence military doctrine for years to come. The door to the briefing room opened, and 4 officers wearing the stars of general rank entered, followed by Captain Morrison and several other senior personnel. Sarah came to attention, not knowing that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined possible. What happened next would become legend in the special operations community, a moment when talent, courage, and dedication converged to create a new standard for military excellence. The young woman who had been underestimated by so many was about to receive recognition that would establish her as one of the most promising officers in the American military. But that recognition would also bring new challenges and responsibilities that would test her in ways that even the Belarus mission had not. Sarah's journey from small-town dreamer to special operations leader was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning.